The Orsimer are built for survival. They're forged in the spine of the mountains, hardened by war and bound by a code older than most empires. They don't fall because they're weak, and they don't rebuild because they're hopeful. They do it because it's all they've ever known. Their history is carved in broken stone and stained with betrayal. Yet every time the fires cool and the dust settles, there's an orc sharpening a blade, laying the foundation for another Orsinium. So what keeps going wrong? Why do they always lose? It's not just about strength, because the orcs have plenty of that. It's not about loyalty either. They're some of the most disciplined warriors on the continent, and their strongholds operate on ancient, unshakable tradition. What we're looking at is something deeper, a pattern buried in their very origins. The Orsimer weren't always orcs. They were once followers of Trinimac, a noble god of order and justice, a guardian spirit of the elven people. But when Trinimac confronted Boethia, things changed forever. He was consumed, twisted, and reborn as Malakath, and his followers were transformed along with him. They became the Orsimer, the pariah folk. Just like that, an entire people were exiled, not by blade or decree, but by divine mutation. That moment of transformation wasn't just a myth, it was a cosmic sentence. They were no longer Mer, no longer part of the elven legacy. Their fall was spiritual, societal, and immediate. From the start, they were cast as the unwanted, the cursed, and every generation since has carried that weight, whether they understand it or not. It's why Orsinium keeps burning. The first city rose in the Rothgarian mountains and was obliterated by a rare alliance of Bretons and Redguards, who set aside their own differences just to wipe it off the map. The second was sanctioned by the Empire and built with cautious optimism, only to fall again when imperial politics moved on and enemies saw an opening. Even in more recent years, when the Orcs tried once more to claim a place in the world with the backing of the Daggerfall Covenant, their position was never secure. No matter how strong the walls or skilled the warriors, Orsinium always ends up abandoned or destroyed. It's not because the orcs are reckless, it's because the world never stops to ask if they should be allowed to succeed. Their neighbors see them not as allies, but as threats or tools. When peace breaks, they're the first to be sacrificed. Even their alliances are transactional. The Empire, the Covenant, the neighboring kingdoms, they've all supported the orcs when it served their interests, but they rarely fought for them when it mattered. At the same time, the orcs themselves have internal hurdles. Their society is bound by the Code of Malakath, a set of honor-based traditions that reward strength and endurance, but can limit diplomacy and political cohesion. Orcish clans often value independence and martial prowess over unification, making it difficult to maintain a stable central authority without outside help or a figure strong enough to command total respect. These factors keep dragging the Orsimer back down, even when they seem poised for greatness. But maybe the most haunting part of their story is that it's easy to forget how much they've lost because they never complain about it. The orcs don't weep over burned cities or vanished kings. They build again, they fight again, and they live under the shadow of a god who tells them that suffering is a virtue, that pain is proof of worth. And maybe that's the cruelest part, because in Tamriel you don't win by surviving, you win by being seen, by being accepted. And the Orsimer have never truly been accepted. They're outsiders in their own land, feared for their appearance, mistrusted for their past, and dismissed by the empires that have failed just as many times as they have. The mystery isn't why they fall. The mystery is why they're always the first ones forced to rise alone. You can look at the map and find ruins where their cities once stood, but what you won't see is the fire still burning in their culture, in their blacksmiths and chieftains, in the quiet pride of a people who know that next time they'll try again, not because they think they'll be allowed to win, but because they refuse to stay lost. This is the story of a race who were never given a place at the table and instead tried to build their own, over and over again. Maybe that's not losing. Maybe that's a kind of victory the rest of Tamriel isn't strong enough to understand. But that's the question we'll chase. Is there something built into the world that keeps the orcs beneath it? Or is it just that no one wants to see what happens if they finally get to the top? The story of the Orsimer doesn't begin with war or exile, it begins with faith. Before they were orcs, they were followers of Trinimac, a god revered by the early elves as a paragon of strength, honor, and righteous order. Trinimac stood beside Auriel and the other ancestors of the Aldmer, a powerful warrior spirit who defended his people from threats, both mortal and divine. But all of that changed in a single, violent moment. When Boeotia challenged Trinimac, it wasn't just a battle of strength, it was an act of divine consumption. Trinimac was devoured, not metaphorically, but literally, and from that unholy digestion emerged Malakath, the god of oaths broken, the god of scorned kin, the god of outcasts, and the faithful who had stood by Trinimac were altered alongside him. They didn't just lose their god, they lost their bodies, their homes, their names. The Orsimer were born not from creation, but from rejection. One day they were elves, and the next they were something else entirely. This wasn't a clean break or a chosen path. It was a cosmic exile, written into their skin and soul, and the world saw them differently because of it. The High Elves, once their kin, now treated them like monsters. They weren't given a new place in society, they were thrown out of it. That's the curse of Trinimac. Not just the loss of a deity, but the forced inheritance of a god no one asked for, and the legacy of being defined by failure. Every Orsimer child is born into a culture that remembers that first betrayal. It's not just history, it's identity. Their skin, their tusks, their place in the world, all rooted in that divine downfall. They didn't lose a war, they didn't betray anyone. They were simply reshaped into something everyone else decided to fear. Malakath teaches that this suffering has meaning, that pain is the forge through which strength is made, that endurance is a kind of righteousness. But even so, it means that the Orsimer culture begins not with a triumph, but with a punishment. They're the only race in Tamriel whose entire origin story is defined by being cast aside. That has real consequences. From the moment they appear in the historical record, the Orsimer are living on the margins, pushed out of elven lands, denied a voice in imperial courts, mocked by Breton nobility, and hunted by Redguard kings. And yet, they never stopped trying to reclaim what was lost. They never stopped building strongholds, raising chieftains, and forging blades that rival any in Tamriel. But it always comes back to that first wound. The Orsimer weren't shaped by ambition. They were shaped by necessity. They're not trying to dominate the world, they're trying to survive in a world that never asked them to exist. Their traditions, the Code of Malakath, the blood price, the reverence for strength, these aren't just cultural quirks. They're systems built to ensure that no matter how hard the world pushes them down, they rise with order, unity, and focus. Even their god reflects that. Malakath isn't a planner. He's not a schemer like Mephala or a deceiver like Boethia. He's blunt force wrapped in bitterness. His sermons aren't about glory, they're about proving yourself through endurance. That message echoes through every generation of Orsimer, creating a people who don't expect fairness, only challenge. But that mindset, while powerful, also creates limitations. It turns diplomacy into suspicion, it turns unity into competition, and it locks the Orsimer into a cycle of building, fighting, and being torn down. Because deep down, their culture assumes loss. It expects betrayal. It braces for rejection. And that's the lasting impact of Trinimac's fall. Not just the creation of a new race, but the encoding of trauma into belief. Every Orcish stronghold is a monument to what was taken. Every Orsinium is a prayer for what might be reclaimed. But at the core of it all is that divine twist of fate. A god swallowed, a people transformed, and a future shaped by exile. That's where the Orsimer story starts, not with a dream of greatness, but with the ashes of something sacred. And everything that follows, every war and every city, is a response to that original loss. The Orsimer didn't choose to be outcast, the world chose that for them. And their entire existence has been a long, bitter walk back toward a place they never should have had to leave. Orsinium is more than just a city, it's a symbol. For the Orsimer, it's a declaration that they belong. Not as scattered clans or isolated strongholds, but as a people with a capital, a future, and a legacy. But the story of Orsinium isn't one of triumph, it's one of heartbreak, over and over again. The first Orsinium rose in the Rothgarian mountains sometime around the early First Era, carved from ambition and determination by Orcs, who had grown tired of living on the outskirts. They built their home in a harsh, unforgiving land, but they made it strong. The city was a fortress, surrounded by jagged stone and steep cliffs, designed to defy the world that had tried to erase them. It wasn't just a settlement, it was a vision, a dream of unity, order, and permanence. As the city grew, so did its influence. The Orsimer began to trade, to expand, to speak with their own voice in Tamrielic politics, and that terrified their neighbors. The Bretons to the west and the Redguards to the south weren't prepared to see the Orcs as anything more than raiders and beasts. To them, a strong Orsinium was a threat to the balance of power, a disruption of the status quo. And so, in 1E 950, High Rock and Hammerfell did something they rarely agreed on. They united to destroy Orsinium. The Siege of Orsinium was a brutal campaign that lasted for 30 years. 30 years of blood, fire, and siege warfare against a city that refused to die quietly. The Orcs fought with everything they had. They weren't just defending their homes, they were defending their right to exist. But in the end, numbers and politics won. The city fell, and the Orsimer were scattered again. What's especially tragic is that Orsinium's fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was a statement. It told the world that no matter how hard the Orcs tried, they wouldn't be allowed to stand as equals. Not because they lacked strength, but because the people around them refused to accept that strength coming from Orcish hands. But that didn't stop them. Over the centuries, the dream of Orsinium kept returning. The second Orsinium rose in the same mountains during the Third Era under the leadership of King Gortwog Gro Nagorm. Gortwog wasn't a warlord, he was a visionary. He pushed diplomacy, negotiated with the Empire, and even claimed a place in the politics of Tamriel. Under him, Orsinium became a center of culture, not just war. He invited scholars, artisans, and leaders from other nations, trying to show the world that Orcs were more than just soldiers. For a moment it worked. Gortwog stood before emperors. Orsinium was recognized as a legitimate kingdom, but peace is fragile, and prejudice runs deep. After Gortwog's time, political support faltered, alliances broke, and the city's influence waned. The Third Orsinium came during the Interregnum, featured in the events of the Second Era. It was backed by the Daggerfall Covenant, a military alliance of Bretons, Redguards, and Orcs. This version of Orsinium was about power through unity, Orsimer working side by side with the very people who once tore their city down. But even then, old wounds ran deep. The Orcs were often seen as tools, not equals, and when the alliance weakened, the city again suffered from neglect, political betrayal, and outside pressure. Eventually, this Orsinium fell too. The most recent attempt at rebuilding came after the Oblivion Crisis, when the Orsimer tried again to create a permanent homeland. Once more, in the Rothgarian Mountains, they built, fought, and hoped. But history repeated itself. Without strong backing, surrounded by enemies, and cursed by centuries of suspicion, the city was once again reduced to ruins by the Fourth Era. Each version of Orsinium had different leaders, different strategies, and different allies, but the outcome was always the same: betrayal, siege, collapse. Not because the Orsimer failed, but because Tamriel never truly allowed them to succeed. Orsinium keeps dying not because it's weak, but because its existence challenges the image that the other races have of the Orcs. They're allowed to be mercenaries, blacksmiths, and brutes, but when they try to be kings and architects, the world pushes back. The fall of Orsinium isn't just a military event, it's cultural sabotage. It's the collective refusal of the Empire, the Bretons, and the Redguards to accept that the Orsimer are more than what the myths say they are. And yet, every time the city falls, the Orcs rebuild it. They return to the mountains, they lay down stone, and they try again. That's the real story. Not a city that keeps dying, but a people who keep refusing to stay dead. Orsinium is a memory, a promise, and a challenge. And the Orsimer keep answering it, even when the world tells them not to. Dabble. The story of Orsinium is the story of a people who won't stay broken, no matter how many times the world tries to break them. After the first Orsinium was razed to the ground in the First Era, the dream should have ended. Most cultures would have turned that dream into a cautionary tale and moved on, but not the Orsimer. They didn't forget. They remembered the shape of that mountain city, the sound of their own language echoing off stone walls, the way it felt to stand in a place they had built themselves. That dream simmered beneath the surface, waiting for someone bold enough to raise it again. In the centuries that followed, the Orcs remained scattered, but the idea of Orsinium never really died. It resurfaced in earnest in the later part of the Second Era, when the Daggerfall Covenant brought together three very different peoples: the Bretons, the Redguards, and the Orcs. For the first time in history, the same nations that had once torn Orsinium down were now its allies, or at least that's how it looked on paper. The Daggerfall Covenant gave the Orsimer a platform, a real shot at recognition, and the resources to start rebuilding. They returned to the Rothgarian mountains, once again shaping the cliffs into homes, temples, and fortresses. The new Orsinium wasn't just another stronghold, it was meant to be a symbol of what unity could look like. And for a while, it worked. The city became a beacon of progress, with traders, scholars, and craftsmen from all across Tamriel visiting. Under the rule of King Kurog, Orsinium saw military reform, cultural revival, and genuine political ambition. Kurog's vision wasn't just to rebuild Orsinium, it was to uplift the Orsimer as a true equal to the other races of Tamriel. But that vision came at a cost. Kurog believed that the only way forward was to break away from Malakath's old teachings. He wanted to replace the traditional tribal stronghold system with a centralized monarchy, and that meant clashing with the chiefs and the shamans who had kept the culture alive during the hard times. He aligned more with Trinimac than Malakath, favoring reason and diplomacy over the path of the pariah. This created a deep divide within the Orsimer people themselves, and while they fought over their future, the outside world watched and waited. Kurog's ambition made him dangerous in the eyes of other leaders. His Orsinium was too strong to ignore, but too fragile to support. Eventually, his efforts collapsed under the weight of internal rebellion and political sabotage. His death fractured the unity he had built, and Orsinium once again fell into a cycle of uncertainty. And then there's the version of Orsinium seen during the events of Iso. This city is alive, it's bustling, it's proud, but it's also desperately trying to survive in a world that still doesn't trust it. The Orsimer are stuck between honoring the past and chasing a future that always seems just out of reach. Even with the support of the Daggerfall Covenant, this Orsinium is treated more like an experiment than a permanent fixture. Every alliance feels temporary, every diplomatic gain is fragile, and every moment of peace is overshadowed by the fear that history will repeat itself. The city is ringed with enemies, from giants in the wilderness to schemers in the court, and the Orsimer are constantly forced to prove their worth to allies who see them as little more than tools for war. What makes all of this even more painful is that Orsinium, time and again, becomes a shining example of what the Orsimer are capable of. The city is not built from conquest or domination, but from resilience. It's proof that the Orcs don't just survive, they create. They shape stone and steel into civilization. They offer a new kind of strength, one that's not just about war, but about building something that lasts. And every time they do, the world tears it down. The fall of Orsinium isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's betrayal, not battle. Sometimes it's the silence that follows when the empire withdraws its support, or when alliances dissolve, or when other provinces choose convenience over principle. The end is always the same. The towers crumble, the streets empty, the dream dies, again. And yet the Orcs return, again. They pick up the pieces, they haul stone up mountain paths, they melt iron for gates that may never be closed again. Because to them, Orsinium isn't just a city, it's defiance carved in stone, a promise that no matter how many times they're cast aside, they will not be erased. Orsinium becomes the clearest symbol of how Tamriel refuses to let the Orcs have a home, not because they're incapable, but because the world keeps moving the finish line. It demands they prove themselves and then changes the terms when they do. It tells them to be civilized, but punishes them when their civilization becomes powerful. And so, Orsinium dies and rises and dies again. And the Orcs, relentless as ever, keep trying anyway. That's not failure. That's what makes their story one of the most enduring in all of Tamriel. The Orsimer are one of the most capable, determined, and disciplined peoples in Tamriel, but no matter how much they contribute, it never seems to be enough to earn them true respect. Time and again they've fought, built, bled, and bargained alongside other races, only to find themselves sidelined, distrusted, or outright betrayed. The truth is, there's no place in the world where Orcs are seen as equals. Not really. The Bretons, who share the region of High Rock with the Orcs, have been some of their longest and most aggressive enemies. This is the same group that helped raise the first Orsinium to the ground during the siege of Orsinium. And even in more peaceful times, the Breton nobility has always looked down on the Orsimer as brutes. Culturally, the Bretons value diplomacy, magic, and social class, and none of those line up with how the Orcs have historically been portrayed. That attitude persists well into later eras, where Bretons still view the Orcs more as mercenaries and bodyguards than as fellow citizens. Red Guards aren't any better. Their warrior culture prizes personal honor, but they've never extended that sense of honor to the Orsimer. The Red Guards were the other half of the alliance that crushed the First Orsinium, and the grudge between them and the Orcs runs deep. In the Second Era, the Red Guards tolerate the Orcs as part of the Daggerfall Covenant, but it's not a relationship based on mutual admiration. The Red Guards view the Orcs as dangerous when left to their own devices, and useful only when they're under close control. Even in shared battles, there's an underlying suspicion, a belief that Orc loyalty only lasts as long as the fighting does. The Nords, on the other hand, might seem like they'd have more in common with the Orcs. They both value strength, both have histories of hardship, and both have strong warrior traditions. But the Nords still see the Orsimer as outsiders. The Orcs aren't true sons of Skyrim, and that divide shows up in the way Nords treat Orc strongholds within their borders. The strongholds are tolerated, but they're never truly welcomed. Orcs can live in Skyrim, but they're expected to keep to themselves, live by their own code, and stay out of the way. When it comes to the Empire, things get more complicated. The Imperials have used the Orcs many times throughout history, often granting them just enough recognition to keep them loyal, but never enough to make them feel truly included. Orcs have served as soldiers in the Imperial Legion, guarded cities, and even taken on roles as smiths and enforcers in Cyrodiil. But the Empire has always seen them as a tool, useful, reliable, but never part of the central plan. The only time the Orcs really got something resembling recognition was when they were granted a province, Orsinium, and even that recognition came and went depending on the political climate. When the Empire was strong, they kept Orsinium on the map. When the Empire was weak or distracted, they abandoned it without a second thought. Even within the Daggerfall Covenant, the alliance where the Orcs were supposedly equals, they never held the reins. High King Emeric, a Breton, led the Covenant, and while he included the Orcs in his vision of a united Northwest Tamriel, they were never given real leadership. King Kurok's ambitions for Orc dominance within the Covenant were constantly undercut by politics. He was tolerated, not supported. His death marked not just the end of a king, but the end of an era where Orcs could imagine themselves as true rulers of a major political bloc. Everywhere the Orcs go, they're either distrusted or devalued. Their warriors are called savage. Their smiths are praised but never celebrated. Their leaders are seen as dangerous or expendable. And yet, when war breaks out, when someone needs a fortress held, or an enemy crushed, suddenly everyone remembers the value of the Orsimer. They're brought in, given temporary honor, used to win battles, and then pushed aside when peace returns. It's not just history repeating itself, it's a pattern. Orcs are expected to prove themselves constantly, and even when they do, the goalposts shift. No matter how noble their cause, how honorable their conduct, or how valuable their contributions, they're rarely invited to sit at the same table as their so-called allies. They're the hammer, not the hand that swings it. The worst part is that this rejection isn't always open hostility. Sometimes it's quiet. It shows up in backhanded compliments, in patronizing alliances, in political maneuvering that leaves them isolated. Even when the world seems to support them, there's always the sense that the support is conditional. The moment the Orcs try to define their own future or assert real independence, that support fades. The Orsimer are one of the few peoples in Tamriel who have never had a homeland that was truly accepted by the rest of the world. They've never been part of a lasting empire as equals. They've never had a seat at the table that wasn't eventually pulled out from under them, and yet they endure. They keep building, keep fighting, keep trying to carve out a place that the world refuses to give them. It's not that the Orcs are doomed to lose, it's that the world refuses to let them win. The Orsimer are built on strength. It's not just what they respect, it's what they live by. Their entire culture is shaped by a need to endure, to overcome, and to earn every inch of progress through blood, sweat, and iron. But that strength, as defining as it is, doesn't always translate into unity. In fact, one of the biggest reasons the Orcs keep losing has nothing to do with outside enemies. It's what happens within. The stronghold system is at the center of traditional Orc society. These aren't just homes, their entire worlds unto themselves, ruled by chieftains who command absolute authority. Each stronghold operates independently, and each follows the code of Malakath. On the surface, this creates a powerful, self-reliant people. But the reality is that this tribal loyalty fractures the Orsimer. There's no unifying kingdom, no enduring council, no permanent alliance between strongholds. Every stronghold is isolated, both in practice and in spirit. And when something threatens the wider Orsimer people, there's no mechanism to rally them all together quickly. Even when a figure like Gortwog or King Kurog rises up and tries to forge a single Orcish identity, the resistance often comes from within. Chieftains don't want to give up their power. They don't want to be told how to lead their people. That stubborn pride, which keeps orcs fiercely independent, also keeps them divided when they need to stand together most. Then there's the Code of Malakath. On one hand, it's a moral compass. It teaches honor, personal accountability, and the value of strength earned through struggle. But the code doesn't prize diplomacy or stability. It doesn't encourage long-term planning or political vision. It rewards endurance over cooperation, revenge over reconciliation. In a world as complex and political as Tamriel, that can be a serious disadvantage. The code glorifies hardship, not prosperity. An orc who suffers and endures is seen as noble. An orc who prospers through compromise or strategic alliance can be viewed as weak or unfaithful. This mindset has shaped generations of Orsimer to value the moment-to-moment fight rather than the slow, often thankless work of building something that lasts. That's not to say orcs can't be visionary. Gortwog tried to reshape how the Orsimer saw themselves, not as cursed pariahs, but as descendants of the noble Trinimac. He dreamed of an Ursinium that would stand as a cultural and political capital, not just a military fortress. But even he struggled with resistance from traditionalists. His vision was grand, but it clashed with centuries of internalized pain and cultural programming that taught orcs not to trust anything that came easy. The leadership disputes within Orsimer society aren't just about who's strongest. They're about ideology. Some orcs follow Malakath to the letter, believing suffering is their divine path. Others want to return to the ideals of Trinimac and move beyond the cycle of struggle. These two visions are fundamentally incompatible. One says, embrace the pain, the other says, evolve past it. And that division runs deep. When these internal battles happen, they weaken the entire foundation of orc unity. A civil disagreement in a human kingdom might end in a negotiated truce or a shift in power. In orc society, it often ends in blood. Orcs fight for dominance, and once they take power, their focus is on maintaining that dominance, not building a shared future. Even when a leader manages to unite the clans, that unity is fragile. It usually lasts only as long as the leader lives or remains unchallenged. There is no deep-rooted system to sustain unity beyond one generation, no tradition of succession, no institutional memory that can carry the torch forward. Every time an orc leader dies, it's like starting over. That's why Orsinium keeps falling, not just because it's attacked, but because it lacks the internal cohesion to survive those attacks. When pressure mounts, old rivalries return. Strongholds pull back to defend their own instead of the larger whole. It's not betrayal, it's habit. It's the natural result of a culture where loyalty to the clan outweighs loyalty to the race. This lack of long-term vision isn't because orcs aren't smart or capable. It's because their culture has been forced into survival mode for so long that survival itself became the end goal. When your people have been exiled, hated, and hunted for centuries, just staying alive becomes a form of victory. But staying alive isn't the same as thriving. And as long as orcs are focused on surviving the present, they'll keep losing the future. The tragedy is that the orcs have all the tools to succeed. They have some of the finest warriors and smiths in the world. Their loyalty, once earned, is unshakable. Their culture, while harsh, is grounded in principles of fairness, merit, and resilience. But until they find a way to move past internal rivalries, until they build systems that reward cooperation and vision instead of just brute strength, they'll always be vulnerable to the same old story. A rise, a challenge, a fall, over and over. It's not a matter of strength. The Orsimer have that in spades. It's about unity. Without it, even the strongest will eventually fall. In the world of the Elder Scrolls, the Orsimer are rarely center stage, but they're never forgettable. They're the war chiefs in the mountains, the blacksmiths behind legendary weapons, the loyal companions who take a blade for you without hesitation. From the moment you meet an orc in any of the games, there's this quiet sense of depth behind the muscle, like there's a whole history of pain, pride, and perseverance carved into every line of their face. And that's the role they often fill, the tragic warrior. They're not usually the rulers of empires, or the ones pulling the strings behind great political events, but they are always part of the struggle, often as allies, occasionally as enemies, and almost always with a story that feels heavier than what's said out loud. They're survivors of broken cities, keepers of lost dreams, and warriors who fight like every battle is the last one they'll get. The storytelling across the series leans into this. In the early games, Orsimer aren't even part of the major political landscape. By the time they gain more visibility, like during the events around Orsinium's many rises and falls, they're framed through their tragedies. The destruction of their city isn't just a historical note, it's a narrative pattern. A city is built, it thrives for a while, then it's razed to the ground. The rebuilding is always hopeful, but never permanent. It sets a tone where orcs aren't allowed lasting victories. They can win battles, they can prove their honor, but they never seem to win the war for a stable place in Tamriel. When you meet orcs in the games, they're usually lone figures or small groups, blacksmiths, mercenaries, soldiers, or hermits. And when they're part of bigger stories, they're often in supporting roles. They help you reach your goals. They offer wisdom born of suffering, strength built from scars. But the narrative rarely lets them be the ones who shape the future. You'll help an orc reclaim a home, but you won't see an orc become High King. You might save Orsinium, but you won't watch it flourish unchallenged. The player's journey tends to emphasize that orc victories only happen with outside intervention. That's not because orcs are weak. It's because their stories are built around resistance rather than dominance. Their identity is wrapped up in struggle, and their role in the story reflects that. Even when an orc is powerful, that power is usually a reaction to loss. They're strong because they have to be. They're disciplined because the world never gave them another choice, and the world around them doesn't forget that. Other races see orcs as useful, but rarely as equals. In the Daggerfall Covenant, for example, the orcs are part of a supposedly equal alliance, but they're never in charge. They're the soldiers and the shock troops, but they're not the strategists or the diplomats. That gap in status reinforces their role in the narrative. Powerful, proud, but kept at arm's length from real influence. The stories we get about orcs often show them at their most noble when they're enduring pain or making sacrifices. An orc will die to defend their stronghold. They'll forgive betrayal if it keeps the clan alive. They'll walk into hopeless battles with no expectation of reward. It's moving, and it's part of what makes them beloved by fans, but it's also a box the narrative rarely lets them escape from. They're allowed to be honorable, but not successful. Their tragedy is almost always the point, and that's not just a storytelling quirk, it's a reflection of how Tamriel's world sees them. The orcs are a mirror held up to the rest of the continent. Their repeated losses make the cruelty of Tamriel's politics feel more real. When Orsinium is destroyed, it isn't just about the city. It's a reminder that even noble efforts can be crushed if the rest of the world doesn't care. When an orc is denied a seat at the table despite their valor, it shows how deeply rooted prejudice is. The world can respect an orc's strength, but still deny their future. And the games don't shy away from that. They let you feel it. You can build Orsinium up again, but you always feel the weight of how fragile it is. You can become Thane in Skyrim and have orc followers at your side, but they still speak about exile and the struggle to find a place where they belong. Even in victory, there's a lingering sense that nothing is secure. This makes the orcs one of the most emotionally grounded races in the series. They're not just there for lore or flavor, they carry a lot of the world's moral weight. Through their stories, you see the costs of political greed, the scars of racial bias, and the consequences of centuries without a homeland. They're the test case for whether Tamriel can ever truly accept difference, and so far, the answer seems to be no. Yet, in all this, the orcs endure. They rebuild Orsinium, again and again. They uphold the code. They pass on their strength through generations, even if that strength is never enough to change the world around them. That's the tragedy, but also the beauty of their role. They may never win on the terms the rest of Tamriel recognizes. But they survive, they persist, and sometimes that's the most powerful story of all. Every now and then, a figure rises from the ranks of the Orsimer who dares to imagine a different future, not one of endless rebuilding and bitter survival, but one where the Orcs can stand tall as equals among Tamriel's great powers. Gortwag Gronagorm was one of those rare leaders. He wasn't a warlord driven by vengeance or a chief bound by tradition. He was a visionary who saw beyond the code of Malakath and imagined a path where the Orcs could step out of the shadows of history and take a seat at the table of nations. He rebuilt Orsinium in the wake of the War of Bitoni and carved out a kingdom that didn't just rely on force, but diplomacy and culture. He challenged the worship of Malakath and embraced Trinimach, hoping to reforge an identity lost thousands of years ago. To many Orcs, it was heresy, but to others, it was hope. Gortwag's Orsinium wasn't just about walls and towers. It was about legitimacy, recognition, and rising above the endless cycle of destruction. For a time, he even gained the attention of the Empire, forcing them to treat Orsinium as a political entity rather than a nuisance. But like so many Orcish dreams, it didn't last. Gortwag vanished from history, and his city, his proof that the Orcs could be more than survivors, faded with him. Then came King Kurog Grobagrak, another leader with a grand vision, this time during the events of Iso. Kurog didn't just want to rebuild Orsinium, he wanted to unify the clans, end centuries of infighting, and establish a modern Orc nation that could stand beside the Bretons and Redguards with pride. He was strong, cunning, and politically ambitious, not afraid to play the game the way other kings did. He invited trade, celebrated art, and hosted festivals. He wanted to move the Orcs from a culture of survival to one of prosperity. In many ways, his Orsinium felt like it might actually break the cycle. The ISO Orsinium DLC lets you walk through a city that feels alive and full of purpose, not just another ruin waiting to fall. You meet scholars, blacksmiths, musicians, and farmers, all proud to be Orcs and ready to build something new. And it's one of the few moments in the entire Elder Scrolls series where it feels like the Orcs might finally win. But then, just like before, the dream collapses. Kurog's vision is challenged by tradition and resistance. His ambition makes him enemies within and beyond his walls. Ultimately, his story ends in blood, betrayal, and another lost chance. Orsinium remains, but the fire of that moment fades. It's not completely destroyed, but the spark that could have turned it into a lasting capital of Orsimer pride is gone. And that pattern raises the question, are Orcs allowed to win? Or maybe more precisely, does their story lose its meaning if they do? The Orsimer narrative has always been built on hardship. They're the underdogs, the survivors, the people who keep standing up no matter how many times they're knocked down. When you give them stability, do you take away the struggle that makes them who they are in the eyes of the world? It's a tricky question, because fans want to see the Orcs succeed. They've earned it. Gortwag and Kurog showed that the Orcs are more than their past. They have the intelligence, drive, and leadership to shape their future. But each time they get close, the world or the narrative seems to pull them back. It might be because their role as tragic warriors is too baked into how the Elder Scrolls universe sees them. Or it might be because real change, lasting change, is hard to tell in a world as chaotic and politically unstable as Tamriel. It's possible the developers want the Orcs to be a constant reminder of what happens when a people are caught between gods, traditions, and the indifference of empires. Their story forces players to reckon with the cost of a world built on conquest and prejudice. Every fall of Orsinium, every lost leader drives that home, but there's still room for hope. Every time Orsinium rises again, it's not just a repeat of the past. It's another chance. The fact that Orc leaders like Gortwag and Kurog even existed shows that the Orsimer are not stuck. They're evolving. And while their dreams might not last, they plant the seeds for the next generation to try again. Whether the games ever let them win in a permanent way is still unknown. Maybe one day, we'll walk through a version of Orsinium that hasn't just survived, but thrived for centuries. A city that doesn't need a hero to save it because it's already strong on its own. Until then, the question lingers. Do the Orcs have to lose for their story to matter? Or can their resilience finally be rewarded with something more than temporary peace? The answer isn't clear yet, but one thing's certain. They're not done fighting for it. You can tear down their walls, raze their cities, silence their leaders, and scatter their people, but the Orsimer always return. That's the real legacy of the Orcs. Not glory, not conquest, not victory in the traditional sense, but endurance. Again and again, history writes them off. Again and again, they climb back out of the rubble. They are not the rulers of Tamriel. They're not the ones who pen the great treaties or carve out vast empires, but they are one of the few peoples who never stay defeated. From the moment Trinimac was swallowed and twisted into Malakath, the Orcs were marked by loss. Not just the loss of a god, but the loss of a place in the world. They became the unwanted, the cursed, forced into exile before they ever had a chance to define themselves. But they didn't disappear, they hardened. And that strength, that refusal to vanish, became the heart of who they are. Every fallen Orsinium is proof of that strength. The first was crushed by the united power of High Rock and Hammerfell, yet it still lives on in memory. The second rose with the help of diplomacy, and burned again with the weight of ambition, but even that failure didn't end the dream. Kurok City was a symbol of modern ambition, and though his vision collapsed, his people did not. Orcs in Skyrim, in Citadel, in Valenwood and Morrowind, no matter how far they're pushed, they build. In strongholds, in outposts, in border camps. Their culture continues, carried in bloodlines, in smithing hammers, in the code of Malakath and the hope of Trinimac. The world tells them they're meant to struggle, and they respond by surviving better than almost anyone. And even when the story doesn't give them the spotlight, even when they're framed as tragic warriors or reliable muscle, their presence changes everything. You can't tell the story of Tamriel without them. They're at every turning point, even when they're not in charge. Gortwog's political brilliance shifted the way people saw Orsimer. The siege of Orsinium shaped the geopolitics of the Iliac Bay. Their smithing forged the finest armor, and their warriors turned the tide in more battles than anyone remembers. And despite all this, they are still outsiders, still the ones on the edge, still treated with suspicion, still fighting for the right to call a mountain theirs without someone knocking it down. That's the cycle. But maybe the cycle isn't the point. Maybe it's the persistence inside it. Because what other race in Tamriel could have been through what they have and still be here? The Aelids vanished. The Dwemer disappeared. Even the Chimer became something else entirely. But the Orsimer endured. And they did it without a homeland, without allies, and with history itself working against them. Every child born in a stronghold. Every chieftain holding a battered war axe. Every orc dreaming of something better. They carry a fire that refuses to go out. Maybe they'll never be allowed to win in the way other kingdoms do. Maybe their strength will always be framed as tragic instead of triumphant. But the fact that they've survived this long, and that they keep trying, might be more meaningful than conquest ever could be. Because surviving when the world is designed to break you takes more than power. It takes spirit. It takes community. It takes a kind of stubborn hope that most empires lost ages ago. That's why Orsinium matters. Not because of its walls or its rulers, but because it keeps being rebuilt. It's a city of ash and iron, of scars and dreams, of people who never had the luxury of forgetting their past. And maybe that's what makes it more real than any marble palace in Cyrodiil or tower in Alinor. Orsinium is never allowed to stand for long, but every time it rises, it's a challenge to the world around it. A reminder that the Orcs haven't given up. A promise that they never will. So if Orsinium rises again, and it will, what then? Will the world finally let it stand? Or will it once again conspire to bring it down? Maybe that's the last fight the Orsimer have to win. Not with axes or swords, but with time, with unity, and with a story that refuses to end in tragedy.